Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So remember, you have the option of watching this video or reading the Flexbook. Regardless of which choice, make sure you're taking detailed notes so that you can get all the information you need for Standard 4. All right, we're going to start with photosynthesis. So this is the equation of photosynthesis. You need to write down and have the equation memorized, but you should know not only the chemical formula, which I'm giving you here, but what those things mean. Right, so photosynthesis, the equation is 6CO2 plus 6H2O in the presence of light yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2. And what that means is 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 water molecules in the presence of light will make 1 glucose and 6 oxygen molecules. Okay, so this is the chemical process that we're talking about. And photosynthesis is going to happen in the chloroplast of plants and algae. So plants are what we call autotrophs. It means that they can make their own food. Another term we could use is producers, right? Because they produce their own food. Other organisms like humans, other animals, right? We are considered heterotrophs or consumers because we cannot make our own food, right? You can't just go sit in the sun for an hour and have the energy you need. You have to go eat lunch. So photosynthesis is the process of making glucose. Right? The whole point of this reaction is to make glucose. And if you remember, glucose, one of those macromolecules, is used for energy for the cell. Oxygen, oddly enough, is just a byproduct, right? The point of the reaction is not to make oxygen. It's just produced as well. So we are going to talk about two big parts of photosynthesis, the light reactions and the dark reactions. There's a couple different names for them, and we'll kind of break down what's going on in both. So one of the things you need to know about with photosynthesis is about the pigments that plants have. So there are certain pigments within plants, typically like on trees, it'll be in the leaves, things like that. But these are pigments that can absorb sunlight. Okay, and what we will see is the most common pigment in plants is chlorophyll A and B. And chlorophyll A and B absorb a lot of violet and blue light. And they absorb a lot of orange and red light, but they don't absorb very much green, blue, yellow light, okay? So because they don't absorb green light, it gets reflected, right? And when it bounces off those leaves, it hits our eyeballs, right? That's why plants look green to us, because they're reflecting green light, right? They absorb the other wavelengths, they reflect green. So if you tried to grow a plant in an area that only had green light, right? If you used like a certain filter over the sun, they wouldn't be able to grow because the pigments cannot absorb that green light. Okay, so the chlorophyll A and B, most common pigments, again, it's why plants look green to us. Now, interestingly enough, in the fall, right, we start to see all these beautiful colors of leaves before they fall. So as the leaves are starting to break down because of the colder temperature, what happens is chlorophyll A and B actually are the first to break down. So what you're left with are all these accessory pigments. And the accessory pigments will absorb green light and they'll reflect things like reds and oranges, which is why in the fall you start to see those red and orange colors on the trees because the chlorophyll A and B have been broken down, which is kind of cool. All right, so those pigments are required, right? That's what's going to let the plant actually absorb that sunlight and use it to make glucose. So we have two main parts of the process of photosynthesis. We have the light-dependent reactions, and we have the light-independent reactions. What comes first are the light-dependent reactions. So light-dependent, right, that tells us they depend on light. So this is the step that requires sunlight. And it's kind of depicted here in these little lightning bolts of sun. But you have to have that light energy for this process to happen. So this is going to take place in the chloroplast. And inside the chloroplast are those individual pancakes called a thylakoid. And we're right actually on the edge of the thylakoid. So we're at the thylakoid membrane. That's where this first step of the reaction is going to take place. So in that thylakoid membrane, you're going to have these photosystems that have pigments to absorb light. Okay, so what will happen is the light comes down, it's absorbed by these pigments. You're going to have water that the plant has absorbed from its roots. And the sunlight is going to be used to split water. Okay, so we're going to split water molecules. And what that's going to do is give us these high energy electrons. Okay, so these are electrons from the water that now carry a bunch of energy. You can think of them like a hot baked potato, right? Because we're going to kind of throw that baked potato around till we get the energy where we need it. So these are high energy electrons, right? Those electrons will travel a little bit down the thylakoid membrane where they'll get recharged by a little bit of sunlight, and then they're going to be picked up by this molecule called NADP+. NADP+ is an electron carrier, and you can kind of think of it like an oven mitt, right? It's going to be able to pick up those high energy electrons. So just like if you wanted to take a hot baked potato out of the oven, you wouldn't use your bare hand, right? You would use an oven mitt, which is like the electron carrier. Okay, so NADP+ picks up those high energy electrons, picks up a hydrogen, and becomes NADPH. Okay, so NADPH is the oven mitt holding that high energy electron. And that's going to move on to our next step, right? In addition, you will also be making some ATP during these reactions. And remember, ATP is an energy source. We'll talk more about it at the end of this video, but it's going to make a little bit of ATP as well, which will also go on to the next step. All right, so to summarize, the light-dependent reactions use light to split water to make high-energy electrons, which are scooped up into NADPH, and we produce a little bit of ATP. Okay. The next step of the reaction is called the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions, or the dark cycle. Right, so the Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions, does not require sunlight, right? Hence the name independent reactions. And that's because they're going to use that ATP we just made and those high-energy electrons we just made. All right, so these guys actually travel over to the Calvin cycle, which is going to take place in the stroma, which is sort of this outside of the thylakoid filling of the chloroplast. And the way that this process works is it's going to take carbon dioxide that the plant is absorbing from the air, and it's going to kind of build it into some different structures, use that energy from ATP, use those high energy electrons from the NADPH, and it's going to create glucose. All right, so in the Calvin cycle, we're actually making the glucose, the sugar that the plant is trying to get, right? And then we rearrange that ATP, or you rearrange the carbon that's left using some ATP so that we can continuously restart this process. Right, so we're always adding in carbon dioxide, we're adding in ATP for energy, we're adding those high energy electrons from NADPH to get glucose. All right, so to summarize, the light independent reactions does not require sunlight because it uses the energy from the light dependent reactions. Okay, and it's going to take in carbon dioxide and it's going to make glucose. All right, and when you think about the equation for photosynthesis, this should make sense to you, right? C6H12, or 6 CO2, right, carbon dioxide, plus 6 H2O, water, makes C6H12O6, glucose, and O2, oxygen gas. So right here you have oxygen gas produced as well. Okay, so that is the process of photosynthesis. Oops, sorry. And again, it takes place in the chloroplast, so the light-dependent reactions in the thylakoid membrane, and then the Calvin cycle in the stroma. And it's going to make glucose specifically. All right, now we can talk about cellular respiration. So the equation for cellular respiration is C6H12O6, glucose, plus 6O2, oxygen gas, yields 6 CO2, carbon dioxide, plus 6 H2O, water, plus energy. And specifically, the energy it's going to make is ATP. Now, what you should notice is this reaction is the reverse of photosynthesis. Right, in photosynthesis, we made glucose and oxygen using carbon dioxide and water and energy, right? Light energy, remember, was written above the arrow. Now we're using that glucose and the oxygen to make carbon dioxide and water plus that ATP. So these are chemical opposites of each other, right? Now remember, plants are eukaryotes just like you, so they have mitochondria as well. They're doing cellular respiration as well, right? So this is happening in all eukaryotes, and even prokaryotes do a version of cellular respiration as well, right? So the kind that we do, us eukaryotes do, is called aerobic respiration. This requires oxygen. But then prokaryotes, like bacteria, they do anaerobic respiration, which does not require oxygen. So anaerobic respiration is going to be less efficient. You're going to make less ATP than you would if you did the aerobic respiration, which again is what we do. All right, so here's our equation, right? Make sure we got this written down. Cellular respiration is going to take place in the mitochondria, and there are 3 steps to cellular respiration. Okay, so we're going to talk about those 3 steps. Okay, so the first part of cellular respiration is called glycolysis, which is spelled right here, right? Glycolysis. And what will happen is this process is going to start with glucose. So remember, we made glucose in photosynthesis, so plants will just use that glucose they made. The rest of us, as heterotrophs, will consume our glucose, right? You're going to eat lunch. That's going to give you those carbohydrates to carry out cellular respiration. So it's going to start with glucose, and glycolysis just takes that glucose and chops it in half, right, to make pyruvate. And what you'll see happening is this over here is that anaerobic respiration that does not require oxygen. And really all you're going to do is glycolysis and then this process called fermentation, right? Now, in eukaryotes, you're going to do glycolysis and then you're going to finish out the rest of the cycle. Okay, so again, you have 2 different forms of cellular respiration. They're both going to use this process of glycolysis, which is the first step of cellular respiration. Now, keep in mind that both forms of cellular respiration will make ATP. Okay, so ATP, remember, is adenosine triphosphate. And ATP, we learned in our macromolecules unit, is a nucleic acid. And when you look at ATP, it looks really similar to RNA and DNA, right? You have a 5-carbon sugar, you have a nitrogenous base, and you have phosphate groups, just like the DNA and the RNA did. Okay, so cellular respiration is going to take ADP and it's going to convert it to ATP. So ADP is like the partially charged battery, ATP is your fully charged battery. And what you should notice is the difference between adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate is 2 or 3 phosphate groups. Okay, so the way that ATP holds energy is it holds it right here in this bond between the 2nd and the 3rd phosphate group, right? And then when the cell needs to use it, it's going to break that bond, releasing that energy. Okay, so cellular respiration will turn ADP into ATP by attaching that 3rd phosphate group full of energy. All right, so let's get back to the process. We already mentioned step 1, which is glycolysis, right? So this is an image of glycolysis. This is going to take place in the cytoplasm, right outside the mitochondria in that cytoplasm. And again, it's going to take your glucose and it's going to chop it in half to make pyruvate. And you will see that this process is going to use a little bit of energy, but it's also going to make a little bit of energy. Okay, it's also going to make some high energy electrons. So this process is going to use an electron carrier called NAD+, so a different one than photosynthesis, right? So NAD+ is going to pick up some high energy electrons and become NADH. Okay, so you're going to make a little bit of high energy electrons carried by NADH. You're going to make a little bit of ATP, right? And you can see we use 2 ATP, we make 4, so you have a net gain of 2 ATP. All right, those pyruvate molecules are then going to head off to the next part of the reaction. Okay, so this is step 1, glycolysis. Step 2 is called the Krebs cycle, and it's also called the citric acid cycle. So it has 2 different names, Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And what will happen is that pyruvate from glycolysis will enter into the mitochondria. And what's going to happen is this process of breaking and rearranging those bonds, right? It's going to use some NADH+, convert it to NADH, right? Just like we did over here. It's going to break, reform bonds, break, reform bonds, break, reform bonds, releasing these high energy electrons. Okay, and they're all going to be picked up by our electron carriers. So both NADH and FADH2. So this is 2 different electron carriers, right? Remember, they're like the oven mitts that can carry those high energy electrons. We're also going to make a little bit of ATP here as well. Not a whole lot, just a little bit of ATP. You will notice the waste product is made here of carbon dioxide. Okay, so again, the Krebs cycle is going to take pyruvate from glycolysis. It's going to break and rearrange bonds, making high energy electrons that are picked up by the NADH, the FADH2, and it's going to make a little bit of ATP with carbon dioxide as the waste product. All right, FADH2 and NADH will then move on to the 3rd step. So the third step is called the electron transport chain. And this should look really similar to you because it's very similar to the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. All right, so what will happen is that NADH, and then it doesn't show the FADH2, but it's here as well, right? They're going to drop off those high-energy electrons, right? So it's going to drop off those high-energy electrons that we just made, right over here. And they're going to travel through the membrane, right, in this electron transport chain until they're weak, right? So that's what they're trying to show you here. High energy, as they move, they get weak, right? And then they're going to be picked up by oxygen to make water, okay? So oxygen is needed to pick up those electrons now that they're low energy and make water. All right, now while those electrons are moving through these proteins, what happens is it gives the proteins a little bit of their energy, right? And those proteins can then pump hydrogen, H+, across the membrane, okay? So these hydrogen ions are moving across the membrane, and that's going to cause a gradient, which means lots of hydrogen out here, not so much out here. So that eventually they start flowing back in, right? And they're going to move through this protein here called the ATP synthase. So the ATP synthase is a protein that sits in the membrane, and when hydrogens start to move through it, what happens is the ATP synthase physically starts spinning, right? It moves in a circle. And that's going to generate enough energy that you're going to take a bunch of ADP molecules and you're going to convert them to ATP molecules. Okay, so it's spinning and it's converting all these ATP molecules. And this is a really effective way to make ATP, right? You're going to get over 30 ATP molecules from this process. So this is like really where the ATP is made. All right, so to summarize, the NADH and the FADH2 bring the high energy electrons over. As they move through the electron transport chain, some of the energy is used to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. Once the electrons are tired, they're picked up by oxygen to make water. And then those hydrogen ions flow through the ATP synthase, which spins and makes ATP. Okay? So again, if you think about the equations for photosynthesis, right, you have C6H12, or the equation for cellular respiration, you have C6H12O6, right? Glucose is required plus O2, right? 6O2, so oxygen gas is required. And it's going to make carbon dioxide, right over here. It's going to make water here and energy in the form of ATP. Okay, so again, what you should recognize is that these are chemical opposites of each other, right? So the products of photosynthesis, what's made in photosynthesis is what starts cellular respiration, and what's made in cellular respiration is what starts photosynthesis, right? Chemical opposites of each other, the difference being the kind of energy, right? We'll use light energy in photosynthesis. We're going to make ATP energy in cellular respiration. This is a very content-heavy standard, so if you're still feeling confused, go back and start looking at the Flex textbook as well, so that you can really get this information down. All right, let me know if you have any questions.